We left off with Detroit, and
Yes.
maybe we can just pick up there.
Yes, I think we stayed about 5 or 6 years in Detroit, 1927 till about 32. I graduated from Eastern High School on Grant Boulevard East in January 1929, as I recall it. And through the recommendation of the salesmanship teacher in Eastern High, I was given a recommendation to Guardian Detroit Bank, which hired me as a messenger for $60 a month. I was lucky because, remember, these years were the years of the Great Depression, and to have a job at all was a tremendous piece of luck. At any rate, I stuck it out at that bank for about 2.5 or 3 years. And then came after the stock market crash, came the collapse of several banks in Michigan. And in 1932, I decided that there was no point staying at the bank. I gave up my job. People in the bank said, "You're perhaps not wise to quit. This recession will be over soon and you'll get your job, or keep your job at the bank." But it was really not getting me anywhere. Meanwhile, our living conditions had changed radically. In 1931 and 32, my mother and we boys decided to live with Dr. Valentiner, the German-born, scholarly, distinguished director of the Detroit Institute of Arts. So we moved into a beautiful apartment 2 blocks within the museum, where Borbin had become an assistant restorer of paintings. And these were a couple of very pleasant years, very stimulating, and with close contact with the Detroit art group and society. At any rate, in 1932, Dr. Valentine decided to dissolve the household again. It was costing too much, I guess. And my mother went back to Schwerin to stay with Tante Lisa, and we boys moved into our own rented room within the block or so. At that point, I went to New York City, hoping to find a job in the import-export business, which was, of course, a naive undertaking because nobody was hiring. Foreign commerce was dwindling. And so after 3 very trying months in New York City, where I lived in an apartment on Riverside Drive, I went back to Detroit to my brother, to Borbin, and hoped for some kind of job to turn up. Well, meanwhile, one of my friends, German friends, Fritz Niederer, who had moved back to Germany, wrote me from Stuttgart saying, "Why don't you come to Germany? Because times are improving here, jobs are available, and he was sure that I'd find something if I came to Stuttgart." Well, this was spring of 1933, and you remember in January of 1933, Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany and started an economic program which created jobs almost overnight. The program consisted of defense industries and also building of superhighways called Autobahnen. All this gave lots of jobs. In addition to that, there was an Arbeitsdienst, or labor service, to which boys and girls were created, and that absorbed a lot of possibly unemployed people also. The labor service eventually became mandatory, and young men and young men especially had to serve a year in the Arbeitsdienst in order to either go to the university or to get a job. At any rate, I decided to try it out. Went to Germany in 1933 in May. I celebrated my birthday, I think, on the ship. I went on a freighter from the Black Diamond Line, I think it was, and there were about six passengers on this ship, which took about 10 or 11 days to get to Rotterdam. Altogether a very interesting experience, because you had free run of the whole ship from back to bow, and from top to bottom, you might say, and we could go into the ship's kitchen anytime and get food and drink, so it was very, very pleasant. And of course, observing life on the ocean, the flying fish, and occasional fin of a blackfish, or possibly a shark, possibly a whale. All this was very diverting, very interesting. At any rate, I arrived in Rotterdam in late May of 1933, took the train to Schwerin, saw my mother and relatives, and then took the train down to Stuttgart. Now a very interesting period in my life developed. In the first place, I was back in Germany, where I felt at home. Secondly, I've associated with new friends in Stuttgart, and mostly in the musical community. Of course, the first necessity was to get a job. So I wrote letters after letters to various concerns in Stuttgart, like Mercedes, of course, and Bleile, and other well-known firms, including a firm that made mouth organs. What do you call them? Accordions? Harmonicas, or cuckoo clocks, all that. But at any rate, out of all this correspondence emerged a job as a sort of bookkeeper at Bleile, which was a famous firm for knitted goods. And after having lived with Fritz in Stuttgart in his room, and on him, because I didn't have any money, and in retrospect, I think it was very decent and generous of him to put me up for about 6 weeks in his own small room, and sharing his meals and so on. But through him I had met various young people in the Stuttgart and Esslingen area who were devoted to singing madrigals. And so I was invited to come out and join them in Esslingen. The chorus, Esslinger Kammerchor as it was called, was directed by Helmut Bornefeld, whom I came to admire greatly as musician and as a person of talent, intelligence, and the reliability, and above all politically either neutral or opposed to the prevailing Nazi regime. At any rate, I found a room in Stuttgart. I advertised actually for a room with a piano, so I did find one with a piano and lived there. Up on the heights, I counted the steps that I had to go from the marketplace up to the Fischerstrasse, where I had the room, and I think it was something like 200 steps. And if you know Stuttgart, you know it has heights surrounding the city, sort of a semicircle of hills, and you had to climb up steps in each or on each of these hills. Good exercise, but I wouldn't want to do that today anymore. At any rate, I became closely attached to the people in the Esslinger Kammerchor and to Bornefeld and his fiancée Waltraud Bornefeld, with whom I'm still in touch today, by the way. And eventually I decided I would want to become a musician too. I guess it was to some extent envy that my friends were involved in such wonderful activity while I was working in a petty bookkeeper's job at Bleile. And the close of the Bleile firm didn't really turn me on, wanted something more interesting. So I wrote letters again to some firms offering my services in the automotive industry or some other challenging industry. So finally an offer came from a firm in Cannstatt called Electron Metall, which I think was just a term for a very light metal like magnesium, which was used, or which they used, for manufacturing cylinders, car cylinders and airplane cylinders. So I took that job. I think it paid me 150 marks a month, which was a very moderate salary, because I know Fritz Niedrer, my older friend, 5 years older, got 300 marks a month. So I lived on a pittance, but my room, I think, cost me 25 or 35 marks a month, so I had enough money left over for food. So I bought a bicycle, wonderful, solid bicycle, to be able to go out to Esslingen once a week. And I did a lot of hiking in the area, including the Schwarzwald, of course, and the Schwäbische Alb, and also the foothills of the Alps. I tried to go skiing, mostly in the Schwäbische Alb area. All of it was very, very satisfying, very stimulating, inspiring even. But the reality of it all was that Germany was coming more and more under a brutal dictatorship, and I had to start asking myself, am I going to stay here? What's going to happen in Germany? And I thought and told some of my co-workers that Hitler was preparing for war, and that sooner or later Germany would once again be involved in a war, and this time an aggressive war. Some of my friends doubted that, but as I said, I had thought seriously of becoming a musician, and I begged Helmut Bornefeld to give me lessons in composition, which he did totally free of charge. Also, that was also a very interesting experience, learning counterpoint and so on.
Let me ask you, this is still 1933.
This is still 1933 and 34, that's right.
So, the political landscape in 1933 began to change radically.
Yes, indeed it did, and it would affect all of us living in Germany, including myself. Anyone could see what happened to opponents of the regime. They were either apprehended by the SS or SA, or they were sent into concentration camps, or if they were Jewish, they would lose their jobs in the professions and their attendance to university and so on. So anyone who had eyes to see and ears to hear would see what is going to happen in Germany. And I had to ask myself, do I want to live in this kind of a society, this kind of country, for the rest of my life? Even though I loved Stuttgart and I loved the Schwäbische people, the Swabian people, I had to ask myself, what should I do next? At this juncture, my mother visited Stuttgart. I think it was in spring of '34, or maybe it was spring of '35. At any rate, she also asked me, what are you going to do about either staying here or going back to the United States? That brought up the question of what citizenship did I have, because I traveled to Germany with a German passport, and I had a return certificate from the United States, which allowed me to stay in Germany for 2 years. And if I did not return, I would no longer be readmitted to the United States, except through the very arduous citizenship, or rather immigration procedure. So I did some quick thinking and decided that I should act before the 2 years are up. And I think I had only a few weeks left before my next birthday and the lapse of the 2 years. I went to the consul, the American consul in Stuttgart, told him my situation, and he asked me, when did your mother acquire American citizenship? And it turned out she did so while I was still a minor, that is under 21, and therefore I acquired citizenship through her automatically. And the State Department sent me an American passport in, I think, May of 1935. So now I was equipped with both a German passport and American passport, and was free to act whichever way I wanted to go. It was difficult to leave Stuttgart and Esslingen, however. I'd become very fond of my friends, including a very lovely girlfriend, and I decided, nevertheless, with war coming and with the Nazi regime becoming more and more oppressive, I had to go. So, almost with a heavy heart, I took the ship once again in Hamburg to New York.
Excuse me, before we leave Hamburg, you told me once that you had met Hitler, and that you had had a run-in with the Gestapo at one point also.
Yes, that's part of the record. Shall I say a few words about that?
Absolutely.
I think it was in spring of 1934 that there was a huge athletic festival in Stuttgart, to which some of the Nazi bigwigs came, including Adolf Hitler himself. And in the evening of one performance, Hitler paraded or rode through some of the narrow streets of the suburb of Stuttgart, where I was living actually, and also where the Mercedes plant is located. At any rate, he drove by in an open Mercedes car, standing with his hands stretched out in the Nazi salute, on a street which was probably only about 4 yards wide. I stood on the very narrow curb. I think the sidewalk was only about a foot wide. These are old villages, you know. And I could have eliminated Hitler had I had a gun with the greatest facility at that particular place. So that was my closest contact with Hitler. But I had closer contact, and very much worse, with the Gestapo, the secret police. who one night threw some pebbles against my window where I was staying. And I opened the window and said, "What's going on?" And the men said, "We came to get the books." I said, "What books?" "Oh," they said, "just the books. You know about it. Just let us in." I said, "I know nothing about the books," and I closed the window. I think I probably slammed it even in anger. Went back to bed. This was in the middle of the night. Within about 5 minutes, they opened the apartment door. I suppose they had a master key of some sort, and came into my room, asked for my passport, and wanted to search the room a bit, asked me where I worked and so on. That all seemed all right. I was working for a dependable company. And they started looking around in my bookshelves. And there I really trembled, because there I had a copy of Vogue magazine with a large caricature of Hitler on the cover. Had they seen that, I think I would have landed in the concentration camp right then and there, but they did not see it. It was on the bottom of a pile, I guess. So they left me, and they went to search the other rooms of the apartment. The landlord couple belonged to the anthroposophic sect, the Waldorf schools and so on, which is a philosophy, of course, absolutely opposed to Nazi ideology and regime. And furthermore, they had, or the woman, the wife, well, I've got to stop for a moment, get this straight. They belonged to the Anthroposophic Society and sent their girl, their child, to the Waldorf school, and obviously they were not in sympathy with the Nazi regime. So after searching their own rooms, they left, and in the morning I asked the landlord what happened, and he said they took my wife with them. We don't know where to and for how long. I asked, why did they do that? And he said, we have a young friend who is communist and who came to visit us sometimes, and apparently she invited him for dinner sometimes or befriended him. At any rate, that they thought was the reason for apprehending her. And as long as I stayed in Stuttgart, which was another year or so, nothing was heard of her or from her. So that was a pretty direct confrontation with the regime. Another was that even in our Esslinger Kammerchor, there were some who had joined the SA, and one even had joined the SS. We made fun of them, right, during our parties and our singing. Didn't hurt. And the boy who became an SS man quit the SS just like that, apparently without any repercussions. He was a very gifted organist, good friend of Helmut and ourselves. But and we made fun of the SA man, as I told you. I think I once performed the Nazi salute like that and knocked off his cap, just deliberately made fun of him. Well, nothing happened. So that was the more liberal climate of southern Germany in those early years. In later years, of course, it was much, much more oppressive. And one of my good friends, a Jewish boy by the name of George Liebel, was, of course, affected by the Nazi anti-Semitic policies from the first day. He wouldn't be able to finish his gymnasium school, and his father would lose his job, and so on, so forth. Eventually he emigrated to England, was put into a camp there during World War II, and evacuated to Canada, and that's where he stayed for the rest of his life, developing a brilliant career in chemistry. And I kept in touch with him all those years. Visited him, in fact, in Montreal, something like 10 or 15 years ago. That's another long story.
Now, what was your impression of Hitler when you saw him?
I was struck by the intense look in his eyes, which seemed to pierce into each one of us who was standing there while he came by. And for a fraction of a second, one felt that he expected you to do your duty. And I was not converted to Hitler, of course, but I experienced the piercing magnetic effect of his eyes, which of course became proverbial in later years when even important generals said that they were affected by his personality and in particular by his eyes, and they were often reduced to inactivity or submission after they had planned to point out some defects or problems in the war operations. But after having been with Hitler in a conference, they usually submitted to his will, partly because of this electrifying influence of his personality. I don't know if that was still true in the last years of the war when he became practically an invalid, but in the early years this was certainly true, and some generals have testified to this in their memoirs. At any rate, that was one aspect of the Hitler regime. So where are we? We're now in Hamburg, taking the ship back to the United States and landing in New York, where Borbin was living in an apartment on 54th Street, and I stayed with him for a few days. Now where to go? I had no job. I had no relatives in the country except for my brother. My mother was in Schwerin again and probably was going to stay there more or less permanently. So I was free to go anywhere in the country. I had come to hate Detroit, and in fact the Middle West, so I wasn't going to go there. I took out a map of the United States, and I said to myself, I want to live in a city that's beautiful, and that's in an environment of mountains and of sea, either lakes or ocean, and of beautiful and rich agriculture and forests. That obviously pointed to the west coast. I didn't want to be in California, however, for various reasons. Everybody went there. So I thought the Pacific Northwest would be the place to go, and I pointed to, or I was attracted to, Portland, Oregon on the one hand, and Seattle, Washington on the other. And I decided for Portland because it had a couple of inches less rainfall than Seattle. So that was it. Well, I had about $50 to myself, and how I was going to get out to the West Coast and live there for a while I hadn't figured out. At any rate, I had to go by bus all the way, which in the Depression was not very expensive. We have to remember that the Depression went on really till about 1938 or so, when America developed its defense industries and prepared for war. But none of that was visible in 1935 when I got there. So I took the bus and first went to Minneapolis, where I visited the only cousin alive, Gus Michaelsen. Stayed with him a couple of days, and he arranged for me to take a truck up to Hibbing, Minnesota, where my mother was now staying as a guest of her brother Ernst Michaelsen. So I visited Minneapolis, lovely city, and then I never forget the night ride on a vegetable truck to Hibbing. I still remember driving through the landscape and hearing the sounds of the night. In the summertime, the nighthawks would make a fairly sharp sound all during the night. And about 5 o'clock the sun started coming out, and the truck took me to, I guess, to some station in Hibbing, where my uncle Ernst picked me up, and I then spent a few days in the desolate, terribly boring town of Hibbing, great mining center. Visited the largest open iron ore mine in the world. My uncle guided me around. And then I had to take the bus on to the West Coast. Went back to Minneapolis and took the bus through the Badlands of North Dakota. I still remember seeing the cactus, little small cactus coming out of the rocky soil there, and seeing a snake or two. Some people told me they were poisonous, I don't know, but the Badlands deserved their name very surely. And from there on through Montana, Dubuque, I still remember, as a desolate town where they said if a man spits on the sidewalk, it splits the stones. A hard living place. And finally got to Seattle, changed the bus, went on to Portland, and I think I arrived in Portland some morning. I don't know what I did with my luggage. I think I had a steamer trunk which came from Germany and was transported to Portland eventually. I don't know how I arranged all that, but all my belongings were in this flat steamer trunk. And as I arrived in Portland, I asked myself, well, where am I going to live now? I don't know this town, and not a soul. So I checked my baggage and walked up the hill on the northwest side of the city, I think it was, called Council Crest, which referred to a place where the Indians used to meet, hold an assembly. I went up the hill of the Council Crest. It was beautifully situated with views onto the 4 main mountains that you see from Portland: Mount Hood in the north, Mount Rainier in the, or I guess Mount Hood in the east, Mount Rainier in the north, Mount St. Helen in the north, and even Mount Baker. All of them snow-covered. Very thrilling, very inspiring. So I looked down from the Council Crest to the city, trying to find a section where I could find a room. And I went down, and many houses had a sign saying housekeeping, rooms for housekeeping or something like that. So I got a room for $5 a week, which was the standard rent in the Depression years. Stayed with a lady who was a fundamentalist Christian and would just preach to me and pray with me or for me all the time, but she was at the same time, being a widow, very friendly, helpful, and supportive. Often gave me a free breakfast and so on. And here again the job search started. Not writing letters, we don't do that here, but going from office to office, asking for the employment officer, and getting the same answer all the time: sorry, we don't hire, and don't you know it's Depression going time, and so on and so forth. But I fell in with a family, John and Mary Lee, who lived up on the heights, beautiful road, I think it was called Overview Road or something like that, where you did indeed have a wonderful overview. And this elderly couple was connected with the Mazamas, an organization or a club really for hiking, skiing, and cultural activities. And they invited me to go on some trips in the area, including up Mount Hood, and up St. Helens, up Mount Baker, and so on. Just wonderful, and I gained many friends that way. And they knew of a German who was a sort of superintendent or so of a small factory, and he might have a job for me, they said. So I went there. It was a firm that made thermostats, and what they needed was another man doing little assembly work. So I got that job for about $14 a week. My room cost $5. So I took the job and immediately invited my mother to come from Hibbing and stay with me. We found an apartment for $8, because it had 2 rooms. $8 a week with a very nice couple. She came, and we somehow made out. I guess she contributed a little bit towards the rent too. But we went for foraging walks in the suburban areas and picked apples, cherries, fruit, peaches, or whatever. Came down on from trees on abandoned lots or abandoned gardens and so on. So that was all very pleasant. Borwin and May also drove out to Portland and visited, and we had a very pleasant family gathering at the beach and so on. That's the time when Borwin acquired that awful poison oak attack, partly because he went to use the forest for a bathroom, and so he probably touched some of that lethal shrub. At any rate, again the question came up, what am I going to do with my life? I had now spent something like 7 years at the bank in Detroit and then bookkeeping jobs in Germany, and what am I going to do now? In other words, I was now 25. In the winter of 1936, the job that I had gave out for the season, I guess, and my mother said, if you can't find another job now, why don't you think of going to college? Well, I had always thought of going to college, but not seriously, because I could never pay the tuition and my livelihood. So I thought, well, maybe since the University of Oregon isn't far away, why don't I go down there and explore? So I took the bus to Eugene, Oregon, talked to the dean or one of the deans there, and they said, yes, it's possible for you to be admitted. The tuition is something like $37 a semester. Those were the days, the Depression. And as for living conditions, there is a co-op student house right near the campus. Why don't you see them? And I did. They said, yes, we have room for one more, and the cost would be $15 a month for room and board. Can you imagine? And besides that, there was the possibility of getting government aid through the National Youth Administration, NYA project, by which the student and myself could get some work helping a professor or raking leaves on the campus or whatever the university needed. And I would be able to get an NYA appointment, which would yield something like, I think, $30 a month or something. Don't quite remember. At any rate, helped me very considerably. So I moved to Eugene. Poor mother had to find a way to stay somewhere, so she accepted a job as a companion for an elderly lady on the near Tillamook on the Pacific Ocean. And she stayed there for as long as I was in Eugene, which was until the summer of 1937. Wait a minute. No, the summer of 1936. Then I was working for a professor on his history of the University of Oregon, which was very interesting because I was able to peruse all the files, the personnel files of professors, and find out how much they were paid and so on and so forth. But this professor and others had told me too, if you want to get a graduate degree, doctor's degree or whatever, go east, young man, go east, because they didn't think that Oregon was good enough. So I applied to the University of Chicago. And now remember, I was by this time 25 years old, which is a pretty old student to start as a freshman again, but I wrote to Chicago, and they came through with a tuition scholarship. Tuition at Chicago was $300 a year, one of the highest in the country in those days. And I decided then to pull up stakes once again and go to Chicago.
So that would have been the spring of 37.
The fall of 36.
Fall of 36.
Fall of 36. Fall of 36?
Fall of 1936.
That's right. Now I was going to the University of Chicago, which in these years was under the regime of the brilliant young president Robert Maynard Hutchins, who had instituted a very progressive reform in the university, which among others provided for general education courses in the main fields of human intellectual endeavor. In other words, very comprehensive survey courses in the sciences, in the humanities, and the social sciences, which were mandatory. Every student had to take these 4 major courses in the first 2 years of his attendance, and in the last 2 years he could take a certain number of specialized courses and electives, and major in whatever field appeals to him. These general courses were extremely rich and extremely challenging also, and extremely inspiring, because one tended to follow up many of the propositions and aspects of in each field with further reading, further work. That was one aspect that attracted me. The other was that one could take examinations in certain courses without attending the courses, and thereby save a lot of time and money. So that by studying there, I was able to take a number of courses by just taking the comprehensive exams, and I was able to graduate from Chicago in 2 years rather than the usual 4 years, which for a student of my age was a big benefit. Here too I received an appointment as an NYA, that is Natural Youth Administration student, making a little money. I think it was probably only $15 a month. And I also got a job as a busboy in the Commons, that is in the student cafeteria, whereby I got something like 50 cents worth pro day, that is pro meal service, which was paid out only in meal tickets, not even in cash, but it gave me free lunches or possibly even free dinners. Not free, I worked for them, but I ate in the Commons. And the third emolument, so to speak, I got was a job living at a surgeon's house on University Avenue for free if I only would take out the garbage pails one day a week, and stayed in the house one day a week to answer the telephone. Those were my sole obligations, and I had a beautiful room, and again a wonderful, in this case, maid who gave me a rich dessert every once in a while. Altogether a very lucky situation for a student coming for the first year to Chicago. I was freshman, of course, even though I had transferred some courses from Oregon. And I was a senior the following year. But it took a great deal of work to satisfy these comprehensive exams. They were, I think, 5 hours or 6 hours in duration. Very, very trying and tiring. But that was part of the challenge. Now, in the meantime, I had met a girl who was a student in English literature, who was also working in the Commons, in this case as the coffee lady. And I was very much struck by her charm and intelligence. Her name was Penelope. And I've got to take a moment off. I've just got to reset my words.
Do you want to take a
can we
quick
go
break?
right on?
Okay, we can go on.
Her name was Penelope King, who hailed from Spokane, Washington, and whose father, Starter King, was a noted columnist and humorist, writing a column for the Spokane papers. At any rate, she was studying literature, and during the years 1936-37, we became very close, and decided to spend that summer at her house in Spokane. How to get out there, though? That's expensive. I read an ad in the newspaper that the factory in Detroit, Plymouth factory in Detroit, was looking for drivers to drive new cars out to the west coast. I thought, that's for me. So I took the bus to Detroit, presented myself without a license. They said, don't need a license. And here's $10, they said, for gas, which would not be quite enough, but helped in those days, because you could get about 10 or 12 gallons for $1 in those days. So I drove this new car from Detroit in the middle of the night. It had a governor on the motor so that one couldn't go faster than 30 miles an hour, and I still remember one harrowing moment in the middle of the night when I was trying to pass a truck, and then I saw a truck coming on towards me from the other side, and I tried to accelerate to get by the truck and couldn't. I don't know how I got by. It could have been a full head-on collision, but somehow the other car must have swerved aside to let me get by the truck. At any rate, got safely to Chicago, back to Chicago, and next day I think already we packed our bags and drove out with this new car to Spokane, Washington. And there I stayed for the summer with her mother. Starlett King had died 2 years before, at a youngish age. Stayed at her house and found a job as a general handyman or workman for a electrical appliance store owned by Eric Johnston, I still remember. He gave me the job after an interview where he said, "I like your English. You speak so meticulously." Well, I don't know if that got me the job or not, but he was also quite meticulous. He, in fact, eventually became president of the United States Chamber of Commerce. And after that, he became movie czar in Hollywood. And so he was a very kind of brilliant public relations personality. At any rate, my job entailed cleaning the ceilings of the whole store, and I can tell you this, standing on a stepladder and looking up this way and brushing off the ceiling was a very taxing job. But he also wanted me to do some carpentry of the furniture, built-in furniture in the store. And finally, he also wanted me to paint the store outdoors, and that's where I got into trouble with the unions. They thought I was violating union laws. Of course, I was not a member of the union, and threatened to harm me one way or the other. But somehow I survived that crisis too. And at the end of the summer, well, I should hasten to add that we got married in the course of that summer of 1937 and decided to go back to Chicago, the two of us, with me studying for my degree, BA degree, and she would try to get a job to earn our living expenses. So we took the train. Well, first we went to San Francisco because our ticket allowed us to go not only to Chicago, across the country, but we could also, on the way, go south to San Francisco, where she had studied at Mills College, and we visited there and saw friends, old friends. Then back to Chicago, where we rented a room. I don't know how much it was, probably only $5 a week too. And the two of us lived in a room, something like 9 by 12, a very small room, but with a widow who offered us kitchen privileges and the run of the apartment. So we survived that for a year. She got a job at a encyclopedia publishing company, and I got a job there too, writing articles about music and history and Luther and whatnot. A very ambitious, challenging job, because you were paid by the hour, and of course you wanted to make as much as possible. And I think I just went to the library and got some general histories or surveys of things and paraphrased many things just out of the books. But it gave me good practice. Then at the end of at the spring of 1938, then I passed the various comprehensives and got my BA degree, and that was a very even moving experience. I said to myself, you really made it. And due to the fact that I could save 2 years. And it was, of course, a very good degree. The University of Chicago was one of the most respected universities in the country. But what next? I was hoping to get a research grant of some sort in Chicago, but that didn't somehow work out. So I wrote to Harvard. Now, this was summer of 1938. Mighty late to apply for admission to that same fall, but I wrote to Harvard, and believe it or not, they admitted me to the history department, which would require our going to Cambridge within a month or so. So in September 1938, we went to Cambridge, Mass., found again one room on Harvard Street, 2 blocks from the campus, very cheap. And here too, Penny found a job, this time first at the Crimson, the office of the student paper, the Crimson, and later a job at the Harvard Observatory, working for Professor Harlow Shapley, a very brilliant, interesting, inspiring person and distinguished scholar. And eventually we had a son born in our one-room sort of attic apartment that we obtained later on Upland Road, I think it was, in Cambridge. A young son a son whom we named Christopher. This was in the summer of I have to figure, when was he born? 1941. Before Pearl Harbor. And that was an important category because to be a pre-Pearl Harbor father exempted one from military service in that period. Pearl Harbor was, of course, December 1941, and for the next 4 years I was exempted by virtue of the pre-Pearl Harbor status and the accumulation of more dependents, one more being my mother, who visited us after 1939. She left Schwerin for good because she didn't want to be in Germany after the war broke out and have her sons be on the other side. So she came, and then in 1944, when I was teaching soldiers at Hamilton College, at Hamilton and Hobart colleges, a second son was born, whom we named Michael. We thought it made a nice combination with Anthon, Michelangelo, or Anthon being a musical combination, as it were. At any rate, at Harvard, I, of course, entered the history department, majoring in or specializing in Renaissance history, German history, ancient history. And after the first year there, I received a Holzer Fellowship for the next 3 or 4 years, which paid for my tuition and some extra funds. So I was very fortunate in having stipends practically the whole period of my graduate career. First, of course, the first hurdle was to pass the general examinations in 4 major fields, oral examination in 4 major fields, and studying for that, and then taking them and getting through with them is in itself a major hurdle, and I don't think I've recovered even to this day, because I remember when I went out of that room after the 4 professors had asked various questions, I felt a letdown, as though I just had to lie down and go to sleep or relax. But within a few minutes, one of the professors came out of the door and said, "Congratulations, Carl." Tremendous relief, just incredible. Well, that was the oral examination. The next thing, of course, was to write a dissertation. And here I decided to combine music, my interest in music, with history, especially cultural history, and decided to write a dissertation on music and musicians in Italy during the Renaissance. In other words, not writing about the music as such so much, but about the social life of musicians and the role of music in society and so on. A topic which my professors had accepted, and I remember I got together a committee of 3. On the side of music, it was Doc Davison, the leader or conductor of the Harvard Glee Club, who was very much interested in the topic. Gaetano Salvemini, the Italian professor of Italian history. And thirdly, Sidney B. Fay, who was specialist in German and World War I history, and was a very kind, helpful, and I think understanding gentleman. So much for the general exams, so much for the thesis, which involved, among other things, going to Smith College to interview Professor Alfred Einstein, the authority on the Italian madrigal, and he was extremely helpful in the first few weeks of my endeavor. When I visited there, he laid out some cardboard boxes with hundreds of slips of notes and excerpts from books and so on, so that he just laid this at my disposal and gave me my first start, just coming across the proper books and authorities and so on. It was lots of fun. Unfortunately, he was a Jewish emigre who got the impression that because I had stayed in Stuttgart for 2 years and was still in touch with friends in Stuttgart, he thought that perhaps I was still in sympathy. I shouldn't say still, that I was in sympathy with the Nazi regime, and he asked me not to come anymore, which was a terrible blow to me because it was a terrible misunderstanding. But I could understand the anxiety of Jewish refugees towards people whose status did not seem entirely clear to them. At any rate, I acknowledged his cooperation in the project in the beginning. Never saw him, of course, but gave me a good start. After 2 years or so of research, during which I not only researched but also taught history in the history department as a teaching fellow, which took a lot of time, and for which I got $1,000 a year, I think. And it's a half-time position, so to speak, which often turned out to be a full-time job because one had to do so much work, so much reading for it and so on. But good experience. Shall I go on? Or?
Let me just ask you one quick question. We're almost out of time, but I want to ask you, where did your original interest in history materialize from?
That was very simple. When I came to Oregon, I was supposed to declare a major, and I was very much influenced by my perception of Borvin's work in painting, and of course his general knowledge also of Italian Renaissance art and so on, that I thought that's what I wanted